My sermon this morning, for which you'll be very thankful, is only about 7 minutes long. Unfortunately, I have a long preface before my sermon. You'll still be out by 12. What I want to do before I read the scripture is tell you a little bit more about the Gospel of Mark. For the first 3 months of this year, Susanna, Daniel, and I are going to invite you to take a journey with us. We're going to go on a journey through the Gospel of Mark. We're going to meet some interesting people, go to some places you've not been before, and have some experiences you may not have expected. On this journey, you're going to learn more about Jesus. We're going to learn more about ourselves as disciples of Jesus Christ. And we may even end up in this journey being a different kind of people than we started out being. We have for everybody, and I hope most of you picked up, a copy at the back here. The first 2 pages are an introduction to the Gospel of Mark. The second 2 pages tell you what we're going to be focusing on each week for the next 13 weeks. And the final 32 pages include the entire gospel. I want you to read the book. Highlight the sections you like. Cross out those you don't. Put little question marks. Put exclamation marks. Write your questions down to the side. When we have finished this whole journey at Easter, 2 weeks after this, we have a special person coming to visit us from Connecticut who presents the Gospel of Mark in a very special way, and we'll tell you more about him later on. I especially invite you in this journey to take someone else along with you. It's always more fun to go with someone else on a trip. You have around you friends and neighbors who have never read the Gospel of Mark. I invite you to take a copy of this. Just give it to them as a gift from you. If they would like to read it with you, that's great, but if not, that's okay also. You can invite them to come to church with you to learn more about this book. But essentially, use it as an opportunity to invite someone else to know the God we worship in this place. On this journey, Susanna, Daniel, and I will be your tour host. But Mark is the tour guide. We don't know a lot about Mark, but he's an excellent person to take us on this trip. The early church has developed a number of legends about him based on bits and pieces that help put this whole book in context for us. The tradition is that Mark came from a Mediterranean village on the northern coast of Africa, on the Mediterranean Sea. He was a traveling companion of a guy named Simon Peter. Do you remember who Simon Peter was? Simon was the fisherman who Jesus saw fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And he invites Simon to come and follow him. And Simon did so. Simon was not educated. He was not a natural leader. But Simon was the first person who said, "You, Jesus, are the Son of God." And Jesus said, "Simon, because of your faith, I'm going to change your name. You're no longer Simon. I'm going to change your name to Peter, which means the rock. And on the steadfastness of you and your faith, I'm going to build my church." Unfortunately, Jesus could have picked a better person than Simon Peter. Simon Peter, when Jesus was arrested, ran off. When Jesus was being interrogated in the house of the high priest, Simon refused to acknowledge they even knew Jesus. He watched Jesus' execution from a distance. But on the day of Easter, Simon was one of the first to see the resurrected Jesus. And Simon Peter became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Simon Peter began traveling, telling people about Jesus. We know lots about what the Apostle Paul did on his journeys, where he went. We don't know as much about Simon Peter, but we do know somewhere along the way he picked up a young man named Mark. And when Simon Peter's ministry was over, Mark went and established a new church in a place called Alexandria. Alexandria, Egypt, is in the Nile Delta on the Mediterranean coast. At that time, it was the second largest city in the Roman world. It had thousands of temples. It was the largest grain exporter in the Roman world. It had the largest library. It had the oldest civilization. It had the biggest buildings in the Roman world, the Egyptian pyramids. Cleopatra and her heirs were political and military leaders of the Roman world. And Mark decided to start a new church in this city. Now think about the religious environment. In a large, prosperous city connected to every other place in the world, there were temples to every god in the world. The Roman gods, the Greek gods. There were probably thousands of priests, magnificent structures, all sorts of documents. Even the Jews were there who had come there from the Holy Land. And think about the difficulty with Mark. Mark said, I want to come and talk to you about a new person, a new God. Doesn't come from Rome, doesn't come from Egypt, comes from a third-rate country over at the edge of the Roman Empire. This person never wrote a book, never knew a political ally, never had a temple built to him, and was crucified by the Romans. Can you imagine how difficult it would be for Mark to tell that story? In that midst, the Christianity was on the verge of extinction. All the people who had seen Jesus face to face were beginning to die. Simon Peter, Mark's mentor, had died and was buried in Rome. Paul had been executed in Rome. Most of the eyewitnesses had disappeared. Most of the Christians, which were now increasingly Gentile, not Jew, including Mark himself, had never traveled to the Holy Land. They'd never seen the places they talked about. But surely someone came to Mark and said to Mark, you know, we're in a city with the largest library in the world. We could take the stories that you have heard about Jesus by Simon Peter and the other disciples. We can write them down, we can copy them, and we can send them throughout the Roman world for you. And that's exactly what Mark did. He was the first biographer. He was the one who wrote down the stories so they would not be forgotten. They had begun to be distributed to Jerusalem, to Corinth, to Rome. In the next generation, other people would build their books on his. A guy named Matthew, a guy named Mark, a guy named John. Other people began writing, but this was the first book. This was the one that everybody based their books on. For the next 3 months, we're going to work our way through these eyewitnesses' account of Jesus. These stories changed Mark. They changed the church that he was serving in Alexandria. Within 200 years, the God that Mark talked about in this book became the major religion. All those other religions were passing by. Their day had come and gone. For 2,000 years, people have been reading the Gospel of Mark to get as close as we can get to a first-hand account of who Jesus was and what Jesus did and what it means for us. So hear the beginning of the story. Chapter 1, verse 1. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah. And then go down to verse 9. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven. You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Mark begins with just a shouted affirmation. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah. Mark has no time for the birth in Bethlehem. There's no Mary, there's no Joseph. There are no angels, there are no animals, there are no magi, there are no shepherds. Mark has to get this message out as quickly and clearly as he can, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, who is the Messiah. The theme of this entire book, as we talk about on the first page, is the secret message of Jesus. What's the secret in the book? In most books, you can't find the secret until the last page. Mark wants you to be clear, there is no secret. Jesus is the Messiah. And if you don't know it, you haven't heard his story yet. Throughout this book, what Mark is going to be doing is showing you a new way to see the world. He is copying the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the beginning of a new world with a new God who walked among us. Do you not see? Do you not understand? And then he talks about when Jesus was baptized, a dove comes from heaven, and God speaks from heaven, this is my Son with whom I'm well pleased. That also goes back to the book of Genesis. When Noah and his family and the animals were saved on the ark, how did they know it was safe to get off and start creation all over again? Because a dove came and had an olive branch in its mouth. And God said, it's safe to come out. It is safe to re-inhabit the world. In Jesus Christ, God is reconciling the world to God's own self. Do you not get it? This is a new creation. Something brand new has happened. God is recreating the world. Jesus is introducing to us the kingdom of heaven. The secret in the Gospel of Mark is nobody else knows that. Simon Peter doesn't know it. The other disciples miss it over and over again. Jesus' opponents miss this truth. The only people who seem to catch on to who Jesus is in this entire book are the demons. Everybody else is clueless. How could he do this? Why would he say that? What is Jesus about? And what we're going to explore through these 3 months is all these people who are witnessing what Jesus did. And we're going to be saying to ourselves, how did they miss it? How could they not catch on to who this guy was? How did they not know he was the Messiah, the Son of God? The problem we have is that we're on the other side of the resurrection. We call Jesus, Jesus Christ. We think Jesus is his first name and Christ is his last name. The truth is, Jesus is what appeared on his birth certificate. Christ is another word for Messiah. It's a title. We believe, or at least we say, that we believe Jesus is God. But when Mark wrote this book, nobody did. They hadn't caught on. The disciples hadn't noticed it. His friends hadn't noticed it. The crowds hadn't noticed it. Mark says, Simon Peter caught a glimpse of it when he said, you are the Messiah. But not till the very end of the book when the Roman soldiers standing at the foot of the cross points up to Jesus at the end of his life and said, truly, this man was the Son of God. What Mark is doing throughout this book is showing us the mystery. And all the people who saw Jesus face to face missed. But he's absolutely convinced that unless we catch that vision, unless we know who Jesus really is, that we'll also miss the boat. So the question keeps coming back throughout the book. Who do you say he is? Who do you think he is? Is it still a mystery? Are you still clueless? Or do you understand that he is the Messiah, the Son of God? If you look at the picture on the front of the book, there are things about it that are just fascinating. We have Mark standing here, writing down on a piece of papyrus what is being given to him out of heaven from God. The Greek words at the top simply spell the word Mark. At his feet is a lion. Mark's image, the icon they always had for Mark was a lion. He's like one roaring in the wilderness. Do you not understand who Jesus is? But what is most fascinating is in the back corner, this little building. What made Alexandria world class was they had a 40-story lighthouse, as tall as some of the buildings in downtown Charlotte, the tallest building in the world, on which was a flame that burned day and night, saying, this city is the light of the world. What this icon says is, compared to Jesus Christ, that 40-story building is insignificant. It's in the background. It doesn't matter. Because what's important is what I'm telling you about Jesus Christ. For the next 3 months, I invite you to join us as we walk through the Gospel of Mark. As we ask ourselves over and over again, who is Jesus? Is he the Messiah? Is he the Son of God? Is there evidence that proves it? And the answer we give to those kind of questions will make all the difference in the world. And at the end of this journey, we'll end up being very different people. Thanks be to God for the gift of the Gospel of Mark.